Commander Jake Harrison sat in his small workshop aboard the Earth station that orbited Mars and looked at the broken device in front of him. The translator was old and heavy, and it had strange markings on its surface that he had never seen before. Quillix, the tall insectoid alien who served as the Galactic Federation liaison, had brought it to him 3 hours ago with an urgent request. The device needed to be fixed before an important diplomatic meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning. Quillix had specifically asked for Jake because humans had a reputation for being good at fixing things that other species considered too damaged to repair. Jake had been working as an engineer for the Earth Colonial Navy for 20 years, and he had fixed countless devices during that time. He liked the challenge of taking something broken and making it work again. His workshop was filled with tools and spare parts and half-finished projects that he worked on during his free time. The walls were covered with technical diagrams and photos of his family back on Earth. His wife Katie sent him messages every week, and his 2 sons were growing up so fast that he barely recognized them in the pictures anymore. Lieutenant Amy Parker walked into the workshop carrying 2 cups of coffee. She was Jake's assistant and had been working with him for the past 6 months. Amy was young and smart, and she had a natural talent for understanding complex systems. She set 1 cup down next to Jake and took a sip from her own cup. She asked him what was wrong with the translator, and Jake shrugged. He told her that Quillix had been vague about the details and had only said that the device had been damaged in an accident. Amy pulled up a chair and sat down next to Jake. Together, they began to carefully disassemble the translator. The outer casing came off easily and revealed a complex array of circuits and processors inside. Jake noticed immediately that the technology was far more advanced than anything the Federation had shared with humanity. The circuits were layered in a way that seemed inefficient and overcomplicated for a simple translation device. Amy pointed out that some of the components looked like they had been deliberately hidden beneath false panels. Jake used his smallest tools to carefully separate the layers of circuitry. He found the damaged component after 30 minutes of searching. It was a small relay that had burned out and left a black mark on the surrounding circuits. The repair itself would be simple, but Jake was curious about why such an advanced device would have such a basic failure point. He told Amy to start analyzing the circuit patterns while he went to get a replacement relay from his parts storage. When Jake returned, Amy was staring at her datapad with a strange expression on her face. She told him that the circuit patterns did not match any translation technology she had ever studied. There were entire sections of the device that seemed designed to do something other than translate languages. Jake felt a small knot of worry form in his stomach, but he pushed it aside. He had a job to do, and Quillix would be back soon to collect the device. Jake carefully installed the new relay and checked all the connections twice. He powered up his testing equipment and prepared to run a diagnostic. Amy suggested that they test the device with some sample translations to make sure it was working properly. Jake agreed and connected the translator to his workshop computer. He typed in a simple phrase in English and waited for the device to translate it into Quillix's native language. The translator powered on with a soft hum. Jake's monitor suddenly filled with data streams and error messages and lines of code that scrolled past faster than he could read. Amy jumped up from her chair and tried to stop the data flow, but the translator seemed to have connected directly to the workshop's main computer system. Jake quickly disconnected the physical cables, but the data was already being displayed on every screen in the room. The information on the screens was shocking. Jake and Amy stood frozen as they read through translation logs and communication records and files that dated back to humanity's first contact with the Federation 10 years ago. The translator was not just converting words from one language to another. It was changing meanings and altering contexts and filtering information in subtle ways that would be almost impossible to detect. Every conversation between human diplomats and Federation officials had been modified by devices just like this one. Jake scrolled through the files and found examples that made his hands shake. When human negotiators thought they were agreeing to fair trade deals, the Federation was actually receiving agreements for significantly better terms. When humans asked questions about Federation technology, the answers they received were incomplete or deliberately misleading. The translator was not a tool for communication, but a tool for manipulation and control. Amy moved to another terminal and began copying the files onto a secure data drive. She told Jake that they needed to save everything before Quillix arrived. Jake nodded and helped her transfer the most important files. His mind was racing with questions about why the Federation would do this and how long it had been going on, and what other secrets they were hiding. He had always trusted the Federation and believed that humanity was lucky to be accepted into their alliance. Now he wondered if everything he thought he knew was based on lies. The data transfer was almost complete when Jake's communication panel beeped. It was a message from the station security desk. Quillix had arrived at the station and was requesting immediate access to Jake's workshop. Amy looked at Jake with wide eyes and asked what they should do. Jake made a quick decision. He told Amy to finish the transfer and hide the data drive, while he reassembled the translator and restored its normal functions. Jake's fingers moved quickly as he disconnected the translator from his computer and reset its programming. He made sure that the filtering functions were active again, so Quillix would not suspect anything was wrong. Amy slipped the data drive into her pocket just as the workshop door opened. Quillix entered the room with his usual smooth movements, and his compound eyes reflected the light from the monitors. He asked if the translator was ready, and Jake forced himself to smile. He told Quillix that the repair was complete and handed over the device. Quillix examined the translator carefully and ran his own diagnostic check. He seemed satisfied with the results and thanked Jake for his quick work. He turned to leave but paused at the doorway. He looked back at Jake and Amy and said something that made Jake's blood run cold. Quillix told them that curiosity was a valuable trait in engineers, but it could be dangerous when applied to matters of politics and diplomacy. He said that the Federation appreciated loyalty and discretion above all other qualities. Then he left with the translator, and the door closed behind him with a soft hiss. Jake and Amy stood in silence for a long moment. They both understood that Quillix knew or suspected something. The question was, how much did he know and what would the Federation do about it? Amy pulled out the data drive and held it up. She asked Jake what they should do next. Jake took a deep breath and told her that they needed to find someone they could trust with this information. Someone who had the power to protect them and the courage to stand up to the Federation. He knew that their lives had just become very complicated and very dangerous. Jake could not sleep that night, and he lay in his quarters staring at the ceiling while his mind raced through everything they had discovered. The data drive was hidden in a secure compartment in his desk, and it felt like a bomb waiting to explode. He kept thinking about Quillix's warning, and wondering if Federation security was already watching them. At 3 a.m, he gave up on sleep and got dressed. He sent a coded message to Amy asking her to meet him in one of the station's maintenance corridors, where they were less likely to be overheard. Amy arrived 15 minutes later looking just as tired as Jake felt. She had brought her portable terminal and told him that she had not been able to stop thinking about the files. She had spent hours going through the data, and what she found was even worse than they initially thought. Jake led her to a small storage room that was rarely used, and they sat down among boxes of spare parts. Amy opened her terminal and showed him what she had discovered. The files contained historical records that went back to humanity's first contact with the Federation. Jake had learned in school that aliens had detected Earth's radio signals and had sent a peaceful expedition to make contact. The official story said that humanity had been invited to join the Federation as junior partners with the promise of sharing technology and knowledge. But the real files told a completely different story. According to the untranslated records, the Federation had classified humanity as a potential threat from the moment they discovered Earth. Humans were considered too aggressive and too unpredictable to be trusted with full knowledge of how the Federation actually worked. The decision had been made at the highest levels to bring humanity into the Federation, but to carefully control what information they received. Every human who left Earth to work with the Federation was monitored and assessed. Their psychological profiles were updated constantly, and their communications were filtered through devices like the translator. Jake had repaired. Amy scrolled through more files and showed Jake something that made him feel sick. There were lists of other species that had received the same treatment. Dozens of civilizations had been given the filtered translation technology and had lived for decades without knowing the truth. Some of them had eventually discovered what was being done to them. Those species had tried to resist or demanded answers from the Federation. Jake asked what happened to those species, and Amy's expression was grim. She showed him a list of quarantined worlds and restricted sectors. Every species that had discovered the truth and refused to accept it had been isolated from the rest of the galaxy. Jake stood up and paced around the small room. He asked Amy if the files explained why the Federation did this. Amy nodded and pulled up another document. According to the records, the Federation was not the democratic alliance that humans believed it to be. It was controlled by a council of 5 ancient species who had formed the original alliance thousands of years ago. These 5 species had advanced technology and vast resources, and they wanted to maintain their position at the top. Newer species were allowed to join, but only if they accepted a subordinate role. The translation filters were just one tool among many that the council used to keep control. Amy found personnel files next, and Jake was disturbed to see his own name in the database. The Federation had detailed psychological assessments of every human in a position of authority or influence. Jake's file described him as loyal and rule-following with a strong sense of duty. It noted that he was unlikely to question authority and that he could be trusted to follow orders. The file also mentioned his family on Earth as a potential point of leverage if necessary. Jake felt angry that strangers had analyzed him so thoroughly. Without his knowledge or consent, Amy's file was there too, and it painted her as intelligent but idealistic with a tendency to challenge unfair systems. The assessment concluded that she needed careful monitoring and should not be given access to sensitive information. Jake realized that the Federation had been manipulating human personnel decisions to put people like him in important positions while keeping people like Amy away from anything that might expose the truth. They spent another hour going through the files, and each new discovery was more disturbing than the last. The Federation had influenced Earth's government policies and had manipulated trade agreements to keep humanity dependent on alien technology. They had suppressed human research into certain scientific fields by claiming the knowledge was dangerous or by offering easier alternatives. Jake understood now that humanity had been in a cage for 10 years, and most people did not even know the bars were there. Amy closed her terminal and looked at Jake. She said they needed to get this information to someone who could do something about it. Jake agreed, but the question was who they could trust. Most of Earth's leadership had been working with the Federation for years, and their decisions had been influenced by the filtered communications. Some of them might be knowingly cooperating with the Federation in exchange for personal benefits. Jake suggested they contact Commander Lisa Grant, who ran Earth's Deep Space Intelligence Division. Grant had a reputation for being tough and honest, and she had the resources to verify the information and protect them from retaliation. The problem was getting to Grant without alerting the Federation. Amy pointed out that Grant was stationed on Earth, and any official travel request would be logged in systems that the Federation could access. Jake thought for a moment and then remembered that there was a cargo ship scheduled to leave for Earth in a few hours. The ship was carrying supplies for the lunar construction yards, and Jake still had friends in the logistics department. If they could get aboard that ship without going through official channels, they could reach Earth before anyone realized they were gone. Amy asked if Jake was sure about this, and he nodded. He said that once they left the station, they would be marked as deserters or worse. Their careers would be over and they might face criminal charges. But if they did nothing, the Federation would continue to manipulate humanity and no one would ever know the truth. Amy took a deep breath and said she was with him. They had stumbled onto something bigger than their careers or their personal safety. This was about the future of their entire species. They left the storage room and split up to avoid suspicion. Jake went back to his quarters and packed a small bag with essential items. He deleted his personal files from his terminal and left a message for his wife that he hoped she would understand someday. Amy met him at a service entrance near the cargo docking bay. She had changed into civilian clothes and carried a backpack. Jake contacted his friend in logistics, who agreed to help without asking too many questions. The friend owed Jake several favors and was willing to overlook the irregular request. The cargo ship was loading supplies when Jake and Amy slipped aboard. They found a large container that was only half full of equipment and climbed inside. Jake's friend sealed the container and promised to make sure it was not inspected before departure. Jake and Amy settled into the uncomfortable space and waited. They could hear the sounds of the loading crew working outside and the vibrations of cargo being moved into place. After what felt like hours, they felt the ship detach from the station and begin its journey toward Earth. They were committed now, and there was no turning back. The cargo container was cold and dark, and Jake could feel the vibrations of the ship's engines through the metal floor. Amy sat across from him with her backpack clutched to her chest, and neither of them spoke for the first hour. The container smelled like machine oil and recycled air, and Jake tried not to think about what would happen if they were discovered. He checked his watch and calculated that they had at least 11 more hours before the ship reached Earth orbit. He told Amy to try to get some rest, and she nodded, but he could see that she was too nervous to sleep. Jake thought about his family and wondered what Katie would think when she found out what he had done. His sons were 8 and 11 years old, and they were proud that their father worked in space. He had always tried to be the kind of man who followed the rules and did his duty. Now he was hiding in a cargo container like a criminal and running away from his post. But every time he doubted himself, he remembered the files and the lies and the species that had been silenced when they asked too many questions. He knew he was doing the right thing, even if it did not feel that way. After 5 hours in the container, Jake heard voices outside. He put his hand on Amy's arm to keep her quiet, and they both held their breath. The voices belonged to crew members who were doing a routine check of the cargo hold. Jake heard footsteps getting closer, and his heart pounded so hard he thought it might give them away. One of the crew members said something about checking the manifest, and Jake heard the sound of a scanner being used on their container. The scanner beeped 3 times, and Jake waited for the container to be opened. But the crew member just marked something on his data pad and moved on to the next container. Jake let out a slow breath, and Amy squeezed his hand. They sat in silence for another hour before Amy whispered that she needed to tell him something. She said that before they left the station, she had sent an encrypted message to a friend who worked in Earth's communications division. The friend was someone she had gone to school with, and she trusted him completely. She had not told him everything, but she had warned him that she and Jake were coming to Earth with important information. Jake asked if she was sure the message could not be traced, and Amy said she had used a personal encryption key that only she and her friend knew. Jake was not entirely comfortable with Amy involving someone else, but he understood why she had done it. If something happened to them on the journey, at least one person on Earth would know they had been trying to reach Commander Grant. The ship suddenly lurched, and Jake heard alarms blaring in the distance. Amy grabbed onto a support beam to steady herself and asked what was happening. Jake listened carefully and recognized the sound of the ship dropping out of faster-than-light travel. They should not be stopping until they reached Earth orbit, which meant something was wrong. He pressed his ear against the container wall and heard crew members running past. Someone shouted that there was a Federation inspection team requesting permission to board. Jake felt his stomach drop, and he looked at Amy with fear in his eyes. The ship's captain tried to argue that there was no reason for an inspection, but the Federation team insisted. Jake heard the docking clamps engage and knew they had only minutes before Federation officers searched the cargo hold. He told Amy they needed to find another hiding place immediately. He used a small tool from his pocket to unlock the container from the inside and carefully opened the door. The cargo hold was dimly lit and filled with rows of containers and equipment. Jake could see a Federation shuttle attached to the main airlock at the far end of the hold. Amy pointed to a maintenance access panel in the floor near their position. Jake quickly pried open the panel and found a narrow crawl space that ran beneath the cargo hold. It was barely big enough for a person to fit through, but it was their only option. Amy went first, and Jake followed her into the cramped darkness. He pulled the panel closed behind them, just as he heard Federation officers entering the cargo hold. The crawl space was hot and uncomfortable, and Jake had to move forward on his elbows. Amy was ahead of him, and he could hear her breathing hard as she squeezed through the tight passage. They crawled through the maintenance tunnels for what felt like an eternity. Jake could hear the Federation officers above them opening containers and scanning cargo. He heard Quillix's distinctive voice giving orders and realized that the insectoid had personally come to search for them. Quillix told his team to check every container thoroughly and to scan for human life signs. Jake knew their body heat would show up on the scanners eventually, and they needed to keep moving. Amy found a junction where the crawl space connected to the ship's ventilation system. She whispered that they could hide in the air ducts where their heat signatures would be harder to detect, among the warm air flowing through the system. Jake agreed, and they pulled themselves up into the larger duct. The air was moving fast, and it was loud enough to mask the sound of their movement. They crawled deeper into the ventilation system and found a spot where 2 ducts intersected. They wedged themselves into the corner and waited. Jake could hear the search continuing below them for over an hour. Federation officers were getting frustrated, and Quillix kept insisting that Jake and Amy were somewhere on the ship. The captain argued that his manifest showed no unauthorized passengers and that the inspection was delaying an important delivery. Eventually, Jake heard Quillix order his team back to their shuttle. The insectoid said something about checking the passenger records at Earth and making sure that Jake and Amy did not slip past security there. The Federation shuttle detached and the cargo ship's engines rumbled back to life. Jake and Amy stayed in the ventilation duct for another 2 hours to be safe. When they finally climbed down, Jake's muscles were cramping and his clothes were soaked with sweat. They made their way back to the cargo hold and found a different container to hide in. This one contained medical supplies, and at least it was cleaner than their first hiding spot. Amy checked her datapad and confirmed that the ship was back on course for Earth. Jake estimated they had about 3 hours until they reached orbit. He told Amy that the Federation now knew they were trying to reach Earth and security at the spaceport would be looking for them. They needed a different plan for getting planetside. Amy said her friend in communications might be able to help if they could contact him once they were in orbit. Jake was worried about using any communication system that the Federation might be monitoring, but they did not have many choices. He told Amy to compose a message that would let her friend know they needed extraction, without saying anything that would make sense to anyone else who might intercept it. The last 3 hours passed slowly and Jake kept expecting to hear more alarms or feel the ship stop again, but the journey continued without incident, and eventually they felt the familiar sensation of the ship entering orbit. Jake knew that orbital security would scan every ship that approached Earth, but the cargo vessel had legitimate business at the lunar yards. If they could get off the ship before it docked at the main station, they might be able to reach the surface without going through official checkpoints. Amy sent her encrypted message and they waited anxiously for a response. 20 minutes later, her datapad beeped softly. Her friend had replied with coordinates for a civilian shuttle bay on the far side of the orbital platform. He said a small maintenance shuttle would be waiting there and no questions would be asked. Jake felt a small surge of hope for the first time since they had left Mars. They gathered their bags and prepared to leave the container as soon as the ship docked. The cargo ship attached to the orbital platform, and Jake heard the crew beginning to unload containers. He and Amy slipped out during the chaos and made their way through the service corridors toward the coordinates Amy had been given. They passed several workers, but no one paid attention to 2 people in casual clothes walking with purpose. When they reached the shuttle bay, they found a small vessel waiting just as Amy's friend had promised. A young pilot was sitting in the cockpit, and he waved them aboard without asking for identification. The shuttle detached from the platform and began its descent toward Earth. Jake looked out the window and saw the blue and white planet growing larger. They had made it this far, and now they just needed to reach Commander Grant before the Federation found them. The shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere, and Jake pressed his face against the window watching the clouds rush past. He had not been home in 2 years, and seeing the planet again filled him with a complicated mix of emotions. The pilot did not ask any questions, and kept the shuttle on a flight path that avoided the main commercial routes. Amy sat next to Jake with the data drive clutched in her hand, and he could see the tension in her shoulders. They both knew that reaching Earth was only the first step, and the hard part was still ahead of them. The shuttle landed at a small military airfield in Colorado, just as the sun was setting. The pilot told them that someone would meet them at the hangar, and then he powered down the engines and left without another word. Jake and Amy grabbed their bags and walked across the tarmac toward a squat concrete building. A young officer in an Earth Colonial Navy uniform was waiting for them at the entrance. She introduced herself as Lieutenant Kelly Brooks and said that Commander Grant was expecting them. Kelly led them to a ground vehicle, and they drove for 20 minutes through increasingly secure checkpoints until they reached an entrance built into the side of a mountain. The facility was deep underground, and the elevator took them down 15 levels. Jake had heard rumors about these kinds of installations, but he had never actually seen one before. The walls were thick concrete, and every door required multiple security clearances. Kelly brought them to a conference room and told them to wait. The room was windowless and sparse with just a long table and several chairs. Amy set her backpack on the table, and Jake could see her hands shaking slightly. He told her that they had done the right thing, and she nodded but did not look convinced. Commander Lisa Grant entered the room 30 minutes later, and she was exactly what Jake had expected. She was tall and fit with gray hair cut short and sharp eyes that seemed to evaluate everything instantly. Two other officers followed her into the room and took positions by the door. Grant sat down across from Jake and Amy and folded her hands on the table. She asked them to explain why they had deserted their posts and why her office had received a cryptic message saying they had urgent information about the Federation. Jake took a deep breath and began to tell the story from the beginning. He explained how Quilix had brought him the damaged translator and how he and Amy had accidentally discovered the filtering system when they repaired it. He described the files they had found showing decades of manipulated communications between humans and the Federation. Amy pulled out the data drive and slid it across the table to Grant. She said that everything was documented and that they had barely scratched the surface of what was in those files. Grant picked up the data drive and examined it for a moment before handing it to one of her officers. She told the officer to take it to the analysis team immediately and to treat it as highest priority. The officer left the room and Grant turned her attention back to Jake and Amy. She asked them if anyone else knew about the files and Jake shook his head. He said that Quilix suspected something, but they had left the station before the insectoid could confirm his suspicions. Grant asked if they had been followed and Amy explained about the inspection on the cargo ship and how they had hidden in the ventilation system. Grant's expression darkened, and she stood up to pace around the room. She said that if the Federation was already looking for them, then the situation was even more serious than she had thought. She asked Jake and Amy to wait in the conference room while her team analyzed the data. She promised that they would be safe here, and that no one could reach them without her permission. Then she left with her remaining officer and Jake and Amy were alone again. They waited for 6 hours and Jake tried to rest but his mind would not stop racing. Amy managed to sleep for a while with her head on the table. Jake thought about his family and wondered if they had been contacted yet about his disappearance. He hoped that Katie would understand eventually, but he knew this would be hard on her and the boys. He had thrown away his career and possibly his freedom because of what he had found in that translator. The question now was whether anyone would believe them and whether it would make any difference. Grant finally returned with several folders under her arm and a grim expression on her face. She sat down and opened the first folder. She told Jake and Amy that her team had spent the last 6 hours verifying the authenticity of the files and running cross-checks against known Federation communications. Every test confirmed that the data was genuine. The translation filters were real and they had been active since first contact. Grant said that her analysts had found evidence of manipulation in thousands of diplomatic exchanges and trade agreements. Everything that humanity thought they knew about their relationship with the Federation was based on filtered information. Jake asked what would happen next and Grant closed the folder. She said that the situation was incredibly delicate and that simply going public with the information could trigger a major crisis. The Federation controlled most of known space and had military forces that vastly outnumbered Earth's fleet. If humanity accused them of lying without proof that would hold up under scrutiny, the Federation could simply deny everything and isolate Earth. Grant said they needed more evidence and they needed allies among other species who might have discovered similar manipulation. Amy asked if Grant believed that other species had been treated the same way and Grant nodded. She said that the files contained references to the same filtering systems being used with at least a dozen other civilizations. Some of those species had apparently discovered the truth and had tried to resist. Grant had already started looking into what happened to those species, and the preliminary findings were disturbing. Several had been placed under quarantine or had experienced sudden economic collapses. One species had completely disappeared from Federation records about 40 years ago. Grant told Jake and Amy that they would be staying at the facility for their own protection. The Federation would be looking for them and Grant could not risk them being captured or silenced. Jake asked if they were prisoners and Grant shook her head. She said they were witnesses and valuable assets in what was quickly becoming a shadow war. She needed them to help her team understand the technical aspects of the translation, filters, and to identify other potential security vulnerabilities in Federation technology that humanity used. Over the next few days, Jake and Amy worked with Grant's analysts to map out the full scope of the Federation's deception. They discovered that the translation filters were just one layer of a much larger system of control. The Federation had influenced Earth's educational curriculum to discourage certain types of scientific research. They had steered humanity toward technological paths that made them dependent on Federation infrastructure. They had even planted suggestions about political policies that would keep Earth divided and weak. Jake spent hours explaining the technical details of the translator to a team of engineers who were trying to build a clean version without the filters. Amy worked with intelligence analysts to identify patterns in the Federation's manipulation tactics. Grant visited them regularly to check on their progress and to share updates about the situation. She told them that the Federation had officially requested that Earth turn over 2 deserters who had stolen classified technology. Earth's government had refused, but the pressure was mounting. On the 5th day, Grant called Jake and Amy into a private meeting. She told them that Earth's leadership had made a decision. They were going to quietly begin developing independent translation technology, and they were going to reach out to other species that might have been manipulated by the Federation. But they needed to move carefully and build a coalition before confronting the Federation directly. Grant said that she wanted Jake and Amy to join her special operations team. Their knowledge of Federation technology and their first-hand experience with the discovery made them invaluable. Jake looked at Amy and saw that she was thinking the same thing he was. They had already given up their old lives, and there was no going back to the way things were. Grant was offering them a chance to be part of something bigger than themselves, a chance to help humanity break free from the Federation's control. Jake asked Grant what exactly the special operations team would be doing, and she smiled for the first time since they had met. She said they would be traveling to other worlds and making contact with species who might be willing to listen. They would be gathering more evidence and building relationships with potential allies. It would be dangerous and there would be no recognition or glory, but it might change the course of human history. Amy spoke first and said she was in. Jake took a moment longer to think about his family and his old life. Then he nodded and said he would do it. Grant stood up and shook their hands. She told them that their training would begin immediately and that they had a lot to learn. As they left the conference room, Jake felt a strange sense of peace. He had made his choice and now he would see it through to the end. Whatever happened next, he and Amy had started something that could not be stopped. The truth was out there and it was spreading. 6 months had passed since Jake and Amy had arrived at the underground facility, and their lives had changed in ways they never could have imagined. Commander Grant had kept her promise and given them intensive training in intelligence work and diplomatic protocols. Jake had learned how to operate stealth equipment and secure communication systems, while Amy had become an expert in analyzing alien psychology and cultural patterns. They had also spent countless hours studying the files from the translator, and each new discovery revealed another layer of the Federation's manipulation. Now Jake stood on the bridge of a small Earth stealth ship called the Ranger as it approached a remote star system far from any Federation patrol routes. The ship was designed to be invisible to most scanning technology, and its crew of 12 was handpicked by Grant for their skills and discretion. Amy stood next to Jake looking at the navigation display that showed their destination. They were going to meet with representatives from a species called the Corvin, who had been part of the Federation. For over 200 years, the Corvin had responded to Earth's carefully worded message with cautious interest. Grant had used back channels to reach out to several species that Earth's intelligence had identified as potential allies. Most had ignored the message or reported it to the Federation, but the Corvin had agreed to a secret meeting and had provided coordinates for a small moon in their outer territory. Jake knew this could be a trap, but Grant believed the risk was worth taking. If they could find even one ally, then humanity would not be facing the Federation alone. The Ranger entered orbit around the moon and immediately detected another ship already waiting on the surface. The ship was Corvin design, and its weapons were powered down in a gesture of peaceful intent. Captain Helen Morris ordered the crew to battle stations just in case, but she gave permission for Jake and Amy to take a shuttle down to the meeting site. 2 security officers accompanied them, and all 4 wore light armor under their civilian clothes. The moon's surface was barren and cold with no atmosphere to speak of. The shuttle landed near a small prefabricated structure that had been set up as a meeting place. Jake could see the Corvin ship about 100 meters away, and several figures in environment suits standing near its boarding ramp. He checked his own suit's seals one more time and then followed Amy out of the shuttle. The gravity was lighter than Earth normal, and Jake had to adjust his steps to avoid bouncing too high. The Corvin delegation consisted of 3 individuals, and their leader stepped forward as Jake's group approached. Through his helmet, Jake could see that the Corvin looked vaguely reptilian with scaled skin and large eyes that could probably see in low light. The leader's suit had military markings, and Jake guessed this was someone important. The Corvin spoke through a translation device mounted on his suit and introduced himself as Commander Thex of the Corvin Defense Fleet. His voice was deep and resonant even. Through the artificial translation, Jake introduced himself and Amy and explained that they represented Earth's intelligence division. Thex gestured toward the prefabricated structure and suggested they talk inside where they could remove their helmets. The structure had been pressurized and heated, and once the door sealed behind them, Jake was grateful to take off his helmet and breathe normally. Thex and his 2 companions did the same, and Jake got his first clear look at them. The Corvin were taller than humans, with muscular builds and sharp teeth that suggested they were natural predators. Thex got straight to business and asked Jake to explain why Earth had reached out to the Corvin with claims about Federation deception. Jake pulled out a data tablet and loaded the files from the translator. He explained how he had accidentally discovered the filtering system and what they had learned about the Federation's manipulation of newer species. Thex listened without interrupting, and his expression grew darker as Jake talked. When Jake finished, Thex was silent for a long moment before speaking. Thex told them that the Corvin had suspected something was wrong for decades but had never been able to prove it. He explained that his people had joined the Federation believing it was a mutual defense pact between equals. But over time, the Corvin had been pressured to take on more and more enforcement duties. They were expected to patrol sectors that other species refused to guard and to suppress uprisings among populations that the Federation considered problematic. When Corvin leaders questioned these orders, they were told it was for the greater good of the Alliance. But Thex had always wondered why the founding species never seemed to take on the same burdens. Amy asked if the Corvin had their own translation devices, and Thex nodded. He said that all Federation communications went through official channels with standardized equipment. Jake asked if they could examine one of those devices, and Thex considered the request carefully. He said that stealing a translator would alert the Federation, but he might be able to arrange for one to malfunction during a routine inspection. If Jake could travel to the Corvin homeworld, Thex could get him access to the device without raising suspicion. Jake looked at Amy, and she nodded slightly. He turned back to Thex and said they would need to discuss this with their commander, but he believed it could be arranged. Thex said that if they could prove the translation filters existed in Corvin equipment, then his government would have grounds to demand a full investigation. The Corvin were a proud warrior culture, and they did not tolerate being deceived or manipulated. If the Federation had been lying to them for 2 centuries, then there would be serious consequences. The meeting lasted another 2 hours as they discussed logistics and security protocols. Thex provided Jake with secure communication codes and explained the political situation among his people. Not all Corvin leaders would support confronting the Federation, and some benefited from the current arrangement. But Thex believed he could convince enough of the military leadership to take action if they had solid proof. He also mentioned that the Corvin had contacts with other species who might be interested in joining a coalition against Federation control. When they finally said goodbye and returned to their respective ships, Jake felt energized for the first time in months. They had found an ally and potentially a pathway to finding others. Captain Morris was pleased with the results and immediately set course back to Earth so they could brief Commander Grant. The journey took 3 days, and Jake spent most of that time working with Amy to analyze everything Thex had told them. They identified at least 5 other species that the Corvin had mentioned as being unhappy with Federation policies. Grant was waiting for them when the Ranger docked at the hidden shipyard that Earth had been building in the asteroid belt. The facility was another secret project that had accelerated since the discovery of the Federation's deception. Earth was quietly building ships and weapons that did not rely on Federation technology. Grant listened to their report and immediately approved Jake's trip to the Corvin homeworld. She said that proving the translation filters were universal would be a major breakthrough. Over the next 3 months, Jake made 2 trips to Corvin space and successfully examined their Federation communication equipment. The results confirmed everything they had suspected. The Corvin devices had the same filtering algorithms and the same hidden monitoring systems. Jake brought back detailed schematics and data logs that Thex had helped him collect. When Thex presented this evidence to the Corvin High Command, the response was explosive. The Corvin military leaders demanded answers from the Federation, and when those answers were not satisfactory, they began their own investigation. Of the Corvin inquiry spread through underground channels and other species started asking questions. Grant's team reached out to 3 more civilizations and found similar patterns of manipulation in all of them. A picture was emerging of a galactic order built on lies and maintained through careful control of information. The founding species had created the Federation thousands of years ago and had decided that they alone were wise enough to make decisions for everyone else. Every newer species was given just enough technology and freedom to be useful, but never enough to challenge the established hierarchy. Within a year of Jake's discovery, a coalition of 7 species had formed in secret. They shared intelligence and technology and began developing their own communication systems free from Federation monitoring. Earth's shipyards were producing vessels at an unprecedented rate, and human engineers were helping other species upgrade their defenses. The Federation's ruling council finally realized that something significant was happening, but by then it was too late to stop it quietly. The Federation sent ambassadors to Earth and to the Corvin homeworld demanding that the coalition activities cease immediately. They threatened economic sanctions and military action if their authority was not respected. But the coalition had grown strong enough to resist. Grant had been promoted to admiral and now coordinated the joint defense plans. The 7 species agreed that they would stand together and would not back down. Jake watched from the observation deck of Earth's new flagship as dozens of ships from the coalition assembled in neutral space. Next to him, Amy held a data pad showing messages of support from civilian populations across multiple worlds. The truth was spreading faster. The